Hi, this is Paul. I want to talk a little bit about technology. Not too long ago, Rebel Wisdom, April 23, Rebel Wisdom had a video on War on Reality, Mary Harrington and Paul Kingsnorth. Recently, they had one of their campfire meetings, and David invited me to it, which I was very appreciative of. And they had Mary and Paul in again. And as was discussed at the end of this video, The War in Reality, they were going to talk about remedies. And it was, I thought, a very interesting conversation. They didn't really get much to remedies. And I think that's partly because, well, it's difficult to talk about remedies, and remedies are really more about doing. But that's a very incomplete answer. Yet, David said he probably wasn't going to share that video on the channel, so I can't do a commentary on it at this point. But I thought it was a very worthwhile conversation that both Paul Kingsnorth and Mary Harrington pursued. I did take quite a few notes, though, during it. And first, some of the stuff from Kingsnorth, you know what? Now, we are not in control of what's going on, and that very much gets into the egregore conversation that there are powers and principalities that are at work, and increasingly we are more aware of them. It's almost like the Enlightenment, which suggested that there are no intelligences above and beyond us. That illusion is slipping away, and we are increasingly aware of the things that are, in fact, controlling us. There's a giant superstructure taking on a life of its own. The ultimate aim of this thing is to allow us to conquer nature. Now, Kingsnorth recently had a piece on his Substack, The Abbey of Misrule, What Progress Wants. And again, it was I thought, a really excellent piece. What was interesting about it is that a lot of people, some of whom sort of surprised me, sent it to me. But it's about this conversation of what does progress want, and a lot of that is this ultimate aim to have us basically take control of, and I'll use C.S. Lewis's language from his book Miracles, our sister nature. The difficulty, of course, and this is, I think, a deep part of the meaning crisis, is that because we are not, because we are siblings, we are siblings with nature. When we try to take control of nature, we continually expose the fact that we are also trying to take control of each other, and that human beings are hackable at a level that deeply disturbs us and sort of ruptures our image of the secret sacred self, which is sort of contemporary, which is sort of a contemporary wall against a complete meaning crisis. I think actually the secret sacred self is the attempt to hold back the meaning crisis from just sort of completely overwhelming many in our culture. And I think it's partly for that reason that today is June 1, that the celebration of Pride Month is just so enormous. And I think it's perhaps part of the reason that the transgender conversation gets so outsized, because I think it's this religious embrace of the identity of the secret sacred self that keeps the meaning crisis at bay, in that there must be something all the way down below which is not simply a machine. more notes from Kingsnorth in that conversation. The ultimate aim of this thing is to allow us to conquer nature, God and creation. We attempt to rebuild creation in our own image. The war on human nature and the rest of nature as well. Conquer our bodies and the natural world. That centers us. It's a vanity project. These guys got good language. It's a vanity project, both accelerating and collapsing at the same time. Framing it as left and right doesn't really work. What do we do now? Nobody who really gets it really knows what to do now. And at that point, Mary started talking. And in the previous podcast, she had used the language of fully automated luxury Gnosticism. It's a war on the given, anything emergent or organic, pure idea controlled by humans. It's a war on ourselves, the givens of our body, as much as people and their bodies. Meat Lego Gnosticism is one of her latest turns of phrase on this thing. Now, I think some of those connections are quite important. And I want to connect them to Jonathan Pageau's video on sacrifice.
You can see that when you fight a war, once again, people think that identities exist, just exist. They don't just exist.
And I think that's true of the secret sacred self, that it's almost like a medieval keep to hold back the meaning crisis, to hold back the annihilation of oneself. We are waging war out there, and we're enormously reactive and defensive about this secret sacred self in terms of our own little keep inside, because we know that if the tools of war out there are pointed to the inside, we will be annihilated. And so, just like Jonathan said, identity is not arbitrary.
I have an identity. I have a city. I have a clan. I have things, a group of people that I identify as having one identity. And now all of a sudden, that group that I identify as one is threatened by a group on the outside. Now, why do I care? Why don't I just give in and cease to exist and become part of that other group? Because I care about these things. I care because also if I am taken over by another group, I will lose the value of what binds me together. I'll become a slave for the other group. I'll become a lower part of the group that's attacking me. And so I want to preserve my identity. I want to preserve the identity of my group. And so I understand in war that I am willing, because I don't know what's going to happen, right? If I am a group and I'm attacking another group in order to expand my identity, expand my power, expand my influence, expand my glory, I don't know what's going to happen, but I am betting on the future that I am willing to sacrifice members of my group in order to reach that goal that I care about. And the same goes for the protective side. I'm being attacked by another group. Why don't we just scatter? Why don't we just run away? Why don't we just cease to exist? And I'm like, no, I want to continue to exist. And I am willing to sacrifice members of my group. I'm willing to kill them for this higher purpose in order to continue to exist as a group. And so,
now this sacrifice, this substitutionary sacrifice is vitally important. Again, if I mention it now, lots of Christians and Protestants and especially Calvinists are going to say penal substitutionary atonement. But beyond the penal aspect of it, this aspect of sacrifice that Pageau is trying to talk about is vitally important, because it's the sacrifice of a part in order to preserve the whole. It's the sacrifice of the part in order to preserve the identity. Little spoiler alert for the last season of The Last Kingdom, but Sigtrygr becomes the husband of Uhtred's daughter. and Sigtryggr is the leader of Daneland up in the north, and that's vital. And then in the fifth season, there's the crisis is that Uhtred's old woman comes back, Brida, and Brida is in cahoots with his father-in-law, this guy right over here, and Brida wants the Danes to win, so the identity to be complete. The father-in-law wants the Danes banished and gotten rid of, but ironically, what that means for both of them is to turn Sigtryggr against King Edward. And that's sort of the setup in terms of the middle of the season that energizes a fair amount of the plot. So both of them succeed to a degree, and Sigtryggr attacks the Saxons, and blood is shed. And, of course, Uhtred will ride in and stop the battle because they have a common enemy, because they have to, in fact, fight some other people. And they have to deal with this nobleman, the king's father-in-law, who is plotting against the king. And they have to deal with Brida. And all of that has to happen. But because Sigtryggr turned against his king, Edward, and broke the treaty, either all the Danes have to die, or Sigtryggr will die for them, thus ending the need to slaughter the Danes. This practice is so assumed, so universal in some ways, that we don't even see it. But this is, in many ways, what a sacrifice is, okay? So part of Peugeot's big point and I thought this video on why human sacrifice was, I think this is one of his best videos. He's just had a lot of really great videos. He's getting better and better at this, as I hope I am, as I hope we all are. But sacrifice affords, all right? Sacrifice affords a better future. The part is sacrificed on behalf of the whole. The small is sacrificed on behalf of the large. Sacrifice is a way to not lose everything. So if you go to videos that talk about what's happening in, let's say, the war against the war in Ukraine. So lately, I've been watching a lot of Sky News in terms of their war coverage, which has seemed pretty good. These cities that the Ukrainians have to sort of pull back from. Well, why do they pull back from a city? They pull back from a city which they desperately want to keep in order to create a better defensive line to better hold the Russians back. And if it's perhaps, on the other side of the river, something like that, they offer in that way a sacrifice in order to achieve or preserve or something like that. And so if you look at Molech, well, what is Molech? Molech is we sacrifice a child in order to achieve something else we want. Whether that be prosperity, maybe it's more children, maybe it's better something for your other children, etc., etc. It's all a sacrifice in order to gain something. Now, I don't know that anybody's really explored the relationship between sacrifice and technology. Because on one hand, there very much is a sacrificial element to technology. And to go back to the question of nature and our war on reality, this conquest of nature, in some ways technology is a part of that sacrifice, both in order to achieve what we want in nature, but also to minimize the amount of sacrifice. So let's say we want clean clothes. Well, if you lived in the developing world, it was no small chore, and it was often the women that did it. The women would take the clothing and they would go down to the river and they would wash the clothing in the river, and it would take a lot of time, and it was very labor-intensive work, and they would come back, and they don't have anywhere near the size wardrobes that we have, partly because if we had to wash all of our clothes by hand, we would wear far fewer clothing. So there's a sacrificial element to getting clean clothes. And what a washing machine, a clothes washing machine, and a dryer, what they do is that they minimize the sacrifice. What they also do is they sort of displace the sacrifice, because now, well, we're still, at least in California, employing streams in order to wash our clothes. We just channel them through hydroelectric facilities to power the washing machine and the dryer in order to clean our clothes. And so our clothing gets clean in far less time. And it's like about once every 2 weeks, I'll have to spend, just a few minutes to put the clothing in the washer and then transfer it to the dryer. Then after that, a little bit more time just to put it away. But compared to, let's say, a woman in the Dominican village, well, I've got it pretty easy. So there's this relationship between technology and sacrifice where, on one hand, there is a sense in which technology is sacrificial. So in order to have a washing machine, I need to sacrifice a degree of my labor towards that to purchase it, to have it in my home. I need to sacrifice a little bit of space in my home, but those are all relatively small sacrifices. And what happens with technology is we sort of do a cost-benefit analysis, and it works out to our better. Now, part of this conversation about the war on nature and the war, see, again, I have to keep pulling it. I haven't really brought in their language yet. This conquest of nature, that this attempt to rebuild the world in our own image, this vanity project, which is our being at the expense of nature, this fully automated luxury Gnosticism, this war on the given, part of this then sort of, and this has been going on for a long time, you see this in 19th century Romanticism, especially at the end of the 19th century. John Muir is a big name here in California, and the Sierra Club, and Teddy Roosevelt. Romanticism very much had a part of this. And so America's national parks, we want to restore them to nature. We need wild places. And, I'm deeply grateful for the fact that at least some places were preserved, although Hetch Hetchy stores all of the water for San Francisco. And the relationship between that, Hetch Hetchy Valley basically had to be drowned, and is drowned regularly, so that San Francisco can have their water. And if you visit Hetch Hetchy, there are all kinds of signs. The reservoir in Hetch Hetchy is a sacred space. You may not go down and touch the water. Why? The water must remain pure. And I mean, the project, this of course happened after the Great Fire, earthquake and fire at the beginning of the 20th century in San Francisco. And there's this great movement of sympathy via the consciousness of the newspapers out into America that San Francisco needed a reliable supply of water. And so Hetch Hetchy had to be sacrificed. And in fact, the engineering is so impressive that there's no pumping needed for the water to flow from Hetch Hetchy up in the Sierra down into San Francisco. And at least to my knowledge, there's not even any purification. The Hetch Hetchy Dam is considered, the Shaughnessy Dam at Hetch Hetchy is considered sacred and holy in the sense that we do today, so the water is untouched and uncontaminated. Now, from the Romanticism of the 19th century on to today, and there have been upticks in this. We certainly had one in the 70s. Many people have sort of turned away in some ways from the modern world. And I thought Kingsnorth was delightfully honest about this in the second conversation, where he basically admitted, and he and I are in some ways in the same place with this. He admitted that, well, he's sort of a product of this movement in the 70s, and so he has, his own farm in, I believe, in Northern Ireland, and his bit of ground. But, and I talked to Michael Martin, who has the same thing in Jackson, Michigan, biodynamic farm, and anybody who knows anything about Rudolf Steiner and the Waldorf schools, they're all big into these kinds of things. And you see it consumerized in the movement to organic foods, fruits, and vegetables, all of this organic labeling, all natural, et cetera, et cetera. Natural is sort of gone now. It's all organic. We keep upping the verbal thing. But Kingsnorth recognizes that this isn't scalable. That for someone like himself who is able to do this, but the world's billions cannot. I often mention this book, which I read a number of years ago, entitled The Alchemy of Air. And it's an amazing book, and it basically talks about the fixation of nitrogen and how before that, guano coming out of South America on these islands that actually I think Peru and Peru and Chile, I think, maybe even fought a war over. This was so vital because, of course, all that captured nitrogen in the droppings of birds and bats were vital for fertilizing fields and the worn-out fields of Germany, but also for munitions. And so once they were able to take nitrogen from the air, well, now we had a nearly limitless supply of nitrogen that we could make synthetic fertilizers and explosives. And so, and at least in that book, they said, well, maybe the carrying capacity at the world's most efficient farms, which tended to be in China, of the world was maybe 3.5 or 4 billion people. And of course, we've long since outstripped that. And that has been afforded by the fixation of nitrogen and the creation of synthetic fertilizer, and on and on and on and on and on. So we have this relationship with technology. And I often go back and I think about the Matrix movies, because in many ways that's one of the issues that the Matrix movies deals with. But there's a lot of wishful thinking with respect to turning the clock back. But the question is, how far back? Because in many ways, you really have to go all the way back to the human control of fire.
Indications of 30, 50% increase in the number of calories. I mean, this is huge, for farmers,
Right.
5% more milk out of their cows, they're a millionaire. And now we're talking, some tens of percent.
Right. Essential a doubling of available calories. And you also pointed out not only the caloric improvement, but the radical decrease in the amount of time it takes to do the processing, like the chewing.
Right.
So, yes.
So this would be really big. And I think the argument that I make about why this happened surely at 2 million years ago is kind of twofold. One is that everything fits at that point. So that's the point at which you see smaller mouths, smaller teeth, evidence of smaller guts, to judge from the shape of the ribs and the pelvis. And by the way, for the first time, a commitment to sleeping on the ground, because for the first time you have a construction of the organism, the human, in a way that is not easy to climb trees.
So that made it possible for us to not have to climb trees. That's the idea, at least in part.
Yeah, the Australopithecines could climb trees, so they surely would have slept in trees. But humans nowadays, you can't imagine them being able to regularly climb up into trees and always be able to make a nest in the way that a chimpanzee or an Australopithecine could. So they'd have to sleep on the ground often. Well, you have to be nuts to sleep on the ground if you don't have fire to protect you. So I think everything, that all points to why it makes sense that fire was first controlled around 2 million years ago, literally about 1.9, and the 1.9 million years ago. And then the other reason is that subsequently to that point, no dramatic events happen in human evolution which could be consistent with the acquisition of something so important as the control of fire. So, there is no subsequent time that makes sense in terms of, oh, yeah, they must have got fire and therefore what? Nothing happens. You get a steady increase in brain size, you get variation in tooth size, but generally it's declining, but no big things.
So this technology thing, I mean, there's no getting away from these garments of skin, as Jonathan Peugeot calls them. There's no getting away from this technology. And, again, part of, oh gosh, what video was it in? Peugeot notes, and again, I hadn't really thought through this, how when you get the vision of the holy city at the end of the book of Revelation, it's actually a vision of technology redeemed. And I think you get the start of that in Isaiah 60. But knowing where to say yes and where to say no, and what is good and what is bad, we just don't simply seem terribly capable of it. And a lot of what we learn seems to be in fits and starts and trial and error, and the trial and errors go on far beyond human lifetimes. I thought of this today the Critical Drinker had a video out today, and it's part of his Why Modern Movies Suck, which is kind of what he's doing. But none of this had anything to do with the message, which, because it's June 1, we're all getting loud and clear, and just about any major corporation. Maybe June 1 is a good example of just showing us just how deeply these corporations are in our lives. But this one deals with CGI overload. And I was thinking about these issues that I was talking about integration of technology and figuring out where they go too far and where they don't go far, thinking about this on these terms.
Watching Top Gun Maverick the other day and thinking about what the actors and film crew must have gone through to actually capture that air combat footage, it really hammered home something that's been pissing me off about modern movies for a long time now. A phenomenon that I could best describe as CGI overloads. Digital technology is advanced to the point where computers can conjure up just about anything our creative minds can imagine, from incredible alien worlds to terrifying monsters and death-defying action scenes. It's revolutionized cinema to such an extent that it's almost difficult to remember a time before it existed. And on the face of it, it should have resulted in a better end product. After all, CGI doesn't rely on actors hitting their marks or force directors to find inventive ways of making difficult scenes possible. It doesn't force stuntmen to risk life and limb to get that perfect visual. It doesn't require complicated pyrotechnics or sound stages or expensive and challenging location shoots. It's controllable, it's predictable, it's safe, it's cost effective, and well, it's boring as fuck.
And I think this gets into the enchantment question as well, because what we discover is that our capacity to manage a palette, we would imagine that if there's no resistance to our will and our desire, that we will get what we want. But this sort of goes back to Karen Wong when she was talking with Wolfgang Smith about her artistic process. And she's, so Karen and I have spoken about a number of things, but she first got into Jordan Peterson because she was studying anomaly. And part of what I think was, a really wonderful conversation between Peterson and Roger Scruton was Peterson was noting that in some ways we know truth best when things resist us. And if technology is the increase of our power, the leverage of removing resistance, if you have to, let's say, prepare a site for a new home, you get an earth moving, you get a bulldozer, or you get an excavator. When we were building the fence, we're not quite done with it, we've still got things to do, but when we were putting in all those post holes, when we looked at the number of post holes we would have had to dig by hand, which is how I dug them at my house with the little post hole digger, Roger came along and said, no, there's an attachment to this excavator that I'm going to rent. And, I'm now, 15 years older than the last time I had to build a fence at my house. And so, yeah, awfully nice to have that auger on the excavator go down and drill that post hole. And yeah, we had to do a little shoveling it out, but it was a world different from going in there at every one with that post hole digger. So there's this relationship here with technology that we have to continue to chew on and to figure out. And one of the points that the drinker makes here is that, now that we have CGI, well, can't we just have everything just work the exact way we want it to?
It feels like movies now are locked into a kind of never-ending dick-waving contest, each striving to outdo the other with ever more ridiculous, overblown, gravity-defying CGI action scenes.
And what he says in that rather vulgar way is that the story itself becomes secondary simply to our capacity to demonstrate to one another how much nature we can defy.
Most of which carry all the weight, impact and believability of a left hook from Natalie Portman. And I mean the non-enhanced version, but don't worry, we'll talk more about that later. And that's not even talking about what the fucking actors have to work with now. Honestly, watch some of the behind the scenes footage of any Marvel movie. It's some of the most depressing shit that I think I've ever seen. Just actors standing around in big empty green rooms, having no fucking clue what they're supposed to be reacting to.
And, right there, in some ways, with the scenes, you can get a sense of what Kingsnorth and Harrington are talking about with respect to, it's one of the things. It's a trope in. Do we really want to just always have our way? Is that what we want in a romantic partner? Is that what we want? And now we're sort of back into the quest of meaning, because part of meaning is, in fact, to lift something heavy, to strive to do the impossible. And that, in fact, is meaningful, and it energizes us for life. And the making of these movies is just, well, you can imagine anything. And then suddenly our imaginations lack meaning.
2. This is it, boys and girls. This is the magic of movie making now. Now, before I go any further, I want to be clear that this isn't just some excuse to shit all over CGI as a concept, or the people that produce it. Computer animators are just professionals doing the job they're hired to do. They're usually overworked, underpaid, striving to meet ridiculous deadlines, and lumbered with the thankless task of producing something that only really gets noticed if they fuck up. I also fully acknowledge that CGI can be a useful tool when it's properly used, and there's been
And I think the drinker sort of has the right tone here. And it's interesting that we're sort of calibrating our relationship with technology bit by bit. We're feeling our way through with trial and error.
Plenty of movies where it was genuinely difficult to tell what was real and what wasn't. That being said, it's not a magical silver bullet that can fix every problem, and when it's been rushed or poorly implemented, well, it can look like absolute dog shit. My general rule of thumb is that if you can do something with stunt work, practical effects, or location shoots, then you probably should. Because believe it or not, humans have actually got a pretty good eye for this kind of thing, and the more you do it, the less engaging your movie becomes. Take vehicle stunts for example. Mad Max 2 from way back in 1981 gave us some of the most incredible car chases, spectacular wrecks and crashes ever shown on screen, to the point where several...
But now, pay attention here. What do you have to do to have this realism? And I think about Burn Power and his texture. What do you have to do? You have to sacrifice that motorcycle. You have to sacrifice those vehicles. In fact, well,
several stuntmen were severely injured in the line of duty. Obviously that's a tragic accident, but it definitely pays off when it comes to what you see on screen.
So in other words, sacrifice doesn't go away. And so sacrifice has this relationship with technology. Want to avoid sacrifice? Technology. And again, but I don't think technology actually eliminates sacrifice. Often technology displaces sacrifice. What is a sweatshop? Isn't a sweatshop just the displacement of sacrifice to others? So many of our technological levers are, in fact, displacement of sacrifice. And I think part of the panic that we're seeing with respect to the cumulative effects of what we've done to the natural order is, in fact, telling that we've been sacrificing, thinking there is no sacrifice to make because we're not paying the price, others are. And hence, if we're not paying a price, it's meaningless.
Every time a car gets flipped or smashed to pieces or blown up, there's a kind of visceral realism to it because, well, it was real. These vehicles...
Again, that Mack truck was paid for, purchased, and I'm sure they bought something that would minimize the sacrifice. They didn't buy a Mack truck off the lot, but the Mack truck was a sacrifice for the sake of the shot.
Vehicles really did get destroyed for these scenes. This poor bastard really did cartwheel through the air because he kind of fucked up his stunt. And the sequel, Fury Road, is probably one of the best examples of limited use of VFX in modern movie making that I can think of. It relied almost entirely on stunt work and practical effects, with just a little bit of CGI here and there to enhance it, and well, it looks fucking great as a result. Now compare it to this scene from The Fast and the Furious that was clearly done with wire work and CGI backgrounds. Notice the difference in terms of immersion and believability. It's basically just a live action cartoon at this point. Or how about this stunt from The Man with the Golden Gun? No special effects for this one. Some mad bastard actually had to corkscrew his way across a river, and
when you see that, you're impressed by it. And this is where you get into this realism question, because back in your imagination, you know, wow, a driver could actually do that. Well, what do we mean by actually? Physically, not virtually, physically. And then suddenly, this gets into the question of what is real and why this dynamic, this tension with stories that we always have. This guy actually drove this car and they engineered the ramp, and wow. If you say it's CGI, it's like, eh.
If he'd misjudged the jump by a few feet either way, he'd probably have earned a one-way ticket to the local ICU. Now,
he had skin in the game.
Compare it to this scene from The Transporter 2, where our man has to use a conveniently placed crane arm to remove a bomb from the underside of his car. Apart from looking fake as fuck, it's also ridiculous on a purely conceptual level, because you know that there's no way anyone could actually hope to time a jump like this. And it's not just cars flying through the air either. Look at this shot from Terminator 2 where a chopper has to fly underneath a freeway overpass. There was no computer trickery involved in this one. They actually used a real chopper flown by a fucking Vietnam veteran, and the shot was considered so dangerous that the film crew refused to shoot it. So James Cameron ended up filming it himself.
And so then suddenly you have questions of, well, what about morality? Is it worth it for a Vietnam vet to try and fly that helicopter through that underpass? Well, now you have a real question. Now you have a real conversation. And I completely understand, unions and regulations that say, well, let's not be foolish with each other, but at the same time, you don't want a situation in which people can't take risks.
Well, it pays off. It looks real because it fucking is. It's the same deal with explosions and pyrotechnics in action sequences. I mean, look at this epic scene from Hard Boiled, one of John Woo's greatest ever movies. All of this was done with squibs and blanks and pyrotechnics, and probably a shit ton of rehearsals to get the 3.5-minute sequence to work. If any one of these actors had missed his mark or fucked up his lines or forgotten his next action, they would have had to start the whole scene again. How many movies today would put in that kind of effort? Or would they just use multiple cuts and highly controllable CGI explosions to produce it in the quickest, safest and most efficient way possible? But what about fist fights? Well, take a look at the subway fight from the first Matrix movie. It's an excellent back and forth fight sequence with solid choreography that doesn't outstay its welcome and actually tells a cohesive story about the shift in momentum between the two main characters. And while there's definitely wire work involved, it's still very much two actors fighting in a real physical location. Every kick and punch has actual weight behind it, and the sets look...
And, it's even interesting where, okay, you've got wire work, and of course you've got, somebody's in a harness and they've got strapped up to wires and they're doing, but even just the physicality of the wires and the levers and all of that is, well, much more than CGI.
Look solid and convincing because they actually exist. They're not just some flat, soulless background that was composited in later. Skip forward a few years to their final battle in the Matrix Revolutions, and what do you get? A CGI Neo and a CGI Smith endlessly punching each other while flying through a CGI city in the CGI pouring rain. You see how much less involving and engaging it is? You see how constantly trying to up the stakes and spectacle actually makes it harder to connect with what's going on? Shit, man.
And I think this is part of the story, that something within us, even though the CGI we imagine will enchant us, it doesn't, because there's no skin in the game. But part of what we see about technology and even modernity are other things that we would never want to live without. In 2014, a very interesting article came out in Christianity Today entitled "The Surprising Discovery About Those Colonialist Proselytizing Missionaries." Basically, somebody did a study. For many of our contemporaries, no one sums up missionaries of an earlier era like Nathan Price, the patriarch of Barbara King Salver's 1997 novel, The Poisonwood Bible. Price tries to baptize new Congolese Christians in a river filled with crocodiles. He proclaims, Jesus is beloved. In fact, the phrase means Jesus is poisonwood. He gets it wrong. And so these missionaries have a bad reputation. What this study discovered was that areas where Protestant missionaries had significant presence in the past are on average more economically developed today, with comparably better health, lower infant mortality, lower corruption, greater literacy, higher educational attainment, especially for women, and more robust membership in non-governmental associations. This is all the work of Robert Woodbury. Now, in the video that Jordan Peterson released a couple of days ago, which I thought was really tremendous, with Vishal Mangalwadi. Very interesting conversation about education. And you can't help but see technology running through this too.
Is detail out the effects on the language and the culture of the societies to which the Bible was, what would you say, to the languages and the societies that were provided with or offered a translation of the Bible because it meant a codification of the language and often the transformation of what was only a spoken language into a written language, to the demarcation of the language as a consequence, to the possibility of a written civilization, and then also to the possibility of that society now developing its own literary vernacular as an offshoot of the biblical corpus.
And this is all obviously technological.
A very interesting development of the word, as a consequence of the translation efforts. Because they often get pilloried in the West, right? Because the missionaries are seen as part of this oppressive Western colonial movement that the radical types who criticize it don't differentiate, right? They just assume it's a unipolar oppressive mechanism that's orchestrated from the top down and purely exploitive.
Absolutely. So Wilberforce is a central figure in this. Three things flow out of his 20-year battle on behalf of India. One is permitting missionaries to go as educators, because all the education was a department of the church. It didn't become a department of the state until much later. So at that time, every teacher is a reverend. University teachers, etc. Bishop is the chancellor of the universities. So Wilberforce he fought for 20 years that it's not enough to send only soldiers and traders to India. God could not have their belief in providence, that history is not a mindless series of accidents, that there is God.
Or a repetitive cycle.
Yes. There is providence guiding history. God called Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You follow me, I will bless you. I will bless all the nations through you. So blessing India was part of God's plan. He could not possibly have given India to British East India Company to be exploited, but to be blessed. Therefore, we must send missionaries to educate India so that they can govern themselves. So it takes 20 years. He loses.
Okay, so let's not gloss over that too quickly. So what we have here is in the midst of structure that could have turned into a permanent empire. We have a movement within that empire itself that draws on its own conscience to reveal to itself that any continued history of exploitation, regardless of how profitable, is immoral. Now, that happens with the slave trade, and it happens in the case of, much of the British Empire, but particularly in India. So they're working against their own financial interests in many ways. It's certainly the case with the war against the slave trade.
Absolutely.
And so that's very weird, right? We want to remark on just how strange that is. That's unheard of.
Well, let me illustrate that Africa point first. British ships are going to Africa. Britain is industrial country.
Now, again, notice the march of technology in this. And for, it keeps cutting both ways.
It is producing a lot of things. It's taking them, selling them in Africa. Africa is not producing anything at that point. So the ships have to go empty to the Caribbeans or the America. There's a limit to how many monkeys and zebras you can take. So they begin to take slaves, which are needed in the Caribbeans, in the tea plantations and other plantations. So you take the slaves, and then they're making sugar.
And again, you see the negative elements of technology, even in the slavery. I mean, slavery has been a perennial issue throughout human history, but ironically, it gets revived by technology.
And you're bringing sugar back to Europe. So this triangle of trade, if the ships are going empty from Africa to the Americas, then the shipping business of England
and slavery can get a toehold because it's way outside on the fringes of of commercial activity and invisible, at least to begin with, in some sense.
And if your ships are not allowed to take slaves, the Spanish will, the Portuguese will. So you might as well. So when Wilberforce is fighting against slave trade, he is hurting the Britain's economic interest. And everybody knows that. And that's why it takes a whole lifetime.
I've read calculations that the British spent more fighting the slave trade than they gained economically from supporting slavery to begin with, by quite a large margin. I don't know if that's true, but...
No, that's true. That's what Adam Smith had already argued in his book, The Wealth of the Nations, was published 1776, the same year as American independence. And he argues that free worker is much more productive and profitable than a slave. So that was true, except that was an academic theory. In reality, the shipping company needs to take something from Africa.
Okay, I want to jump a little bit ahead back to the language question.
Of a Bible translated into almost all the languages that the Bible has been translated into. And there's a variety of empty shelves, although a small proportion, that are devoted to the next decades. I think they figured the Bible will be translated into virtually every living language within 40 years from now, something like that. And so those biblical translators had tremendous respect for the local vernaculars. They transformed them into written languages, which was no small feat. And they enabled all of those people to start to learn to read and to think for themselves. That's how it looks.
Right. So
it's likewise the case that in Europe, the monasteries were the central focus of what became partly industrial production and also institutes of higher education. So this idea that the biblical world was opposed to education and to enlightenment in general, that's false. That's just false. It's backwards.
Absolutely true. Everyone agreed, whether Christians or non-Christians, politicians, everyone agreed that if India had to be reformed, vernaculars had to be developed, because that is what happened in Europe.
Okay, so watch technology and its process through and its contributions through this too.
Latin was the language of learning, language of courts. But with the Reformation, German and French and English and Spanish and Portuguese, every language began to be developed. And so, because that's what the principle of human equality meant, that every child should be able to study in his own mother tongue, in his own heart language.
Right. Well, every soul had to be reached.
Yes. But also not just reached to be taken to heaven, but reached to become king, because the Lamb of God shed his blood so that slaves of Satan are transformed into sons of God, serving their father, managing his affairs, doing his will in their lives, and making sure that God's will is being done on earth. So everyone becomes a king. And therefore, the truth of God, what is God's will? I can't do God's will if I don't know God and if I don't know his will. So everyone has to be educated in his own mother tongue. This is the thrust of the entire missionary enterprise, British and non-British, in India. But the question is, what exactly will develop Indian vernaculars? No Pandit, no Imam had any interest in any of Indian languages at that time. India had 3 classical languages. Sanskrit was the language of Brahmins, but only of males. Arabic was the language of the mosque, of imams.
And the only language that the Quran could be distributed in.
At that time. And Persian. So Mughal Emperor, Humayun, had made Persian the official court language of India in order to keep the non-Persian speaking Muslims away from the throne. So the Persian was a sophisticated language, but in India it was used as a language of discrimination, just as Sanskrit was used as a language of discrimination against women and against lower caste. So no Hindu Muslim scholar had any interest in any of Indian languages. The current national language, Hindi, didn't exist. Urdu didn't exist. There were dialects that these missionaries began to transform. First was Hindustani.
Well, right. And we should concentrate on that too, because people don't really understand this. You know, when I went to Switzerland in 1982, there were still places in the backwoods in Switzerland where the people at the top of the mountain spoke a language so different from the people at the bottom that they couldn't understand each other.
Yes.
And so the rule of thumb for languages isn't, well, the language is basically comprehensible by everyone, but there are various accents. The rule is that there's an unbelievable multitude of dialects such that people in one village can't understand the people in the next village. And so then the European missionaries come in and start to codify and unite these languages and also to give them their written expression. First of all, developing an alphabet often.
Correct. So the question that really occupied was that once you have these 100,000 rupees, how is that money going to be used? And there were classicists who were saying that we should use this money to teach Sanskrit, Arabic, and Persian. So there was already Sanskrit College in Banaras funded by East India Company, and Calcutta Madrasa teaching Arabic funded by East India Company. But others began to say,
Notice the East India Company is funding these things.
Look, if somebody masters all the Sanskrit literature and all the Arabic literature, he or she is not going to be able to give in vernacular knowledge of science, knowledge of economics, knowledge of technology, of law.
Right, these productive fields, whose development you also traced in large part to the monastic tradition.
Yes. So that's why it was the Anglicists argued that we can't educate everybody with the limited money that we have. Therefore, let's teach English. So there will be a group of Indians, small group of Indians, who are able to read English literature and take the knowledge from England, give it into Bengali, give it into Gujarati and Hindi. So English language was brought to India to empower Indian vernaculars. Now, we have many high caste Hindus.
Do you suppose that there's a single university in the West that actually teaches that fact?
Well, a friend of mine took these ideas which you have read and wrote a PhD thesis, which was submitted to the University of Nagpur. 5 Brahmins were appointed to study his thesis before giving him a PhD. They took 5 years to investigate his thesis because he was showing that every single modern Indian vernacular language is creation of Bible translators. After 5 years, they gave him a PhD and they wrote in their recommendation letter that when his book is published, it should be a required reading in all the department of linguistics, that every single modern Indian language is a creation of Bible translators.
So that's absolutely unbelievable. And you
know, if you watch the whole thing, you'll find out that if there wasn't many of these languages, they weren't written down. They were just simply oral. And so then the technologies of alphabet, of printing press, of all of this come back into and at least afford the preservation of these languages, the inscripturation of these languages, which then would afford much more cultural development. And so, you know, as we work through these questions of technology moving forward, number one, there'll be a lot of fits and starts. There'll be a lot of dead ends. There'll be a lot of things that we get to a certain point and we realize, you know, this was a bad end. We're going to have to go somewhere else. I'm going to let the critical drinker finish his little tirade here because I think he ends with sort of the right sense of this.
Man, Star Wars fell victim to this kind of thing decades ago. The lightsaber fights between Luke and Vader in AOT weren't big choreographed affairs with incredible moves and spectacular effects shots. Most of the time, they were fighting in dimly lit rooms and corridors.
Again, in some ways, this is the natural.
It was tight and claustrophobic and clumsy at times, but it worked because it was more about the emotions of the two characters than the moves they could pull off. The physical constraints of the time forced the director to focus more on the emotion of the characters, and it paid off. Then compare it to the fight between Anakin and Obi-Wan in Revenge of the Sith. That shit's got them flying and leaping all over the place in CGI form, pulling off very obviously choreographed moves, and battling through crazy spectacular landscapes for what feels like 15 minutes straight. It reeks of excess and over-the-top spectacle at the expense of good storytelling, and it pretty much exemplifies the lesson that bigger isn't always better. But what about creatures and monsters, you might ask? I mean, we've been fascinated with stuff like that since the dawn of cinema. What's scarier than a good monster? Well, terrifyingly bad CGI. And no, I'm not even going into the obvious stuff like the hilariously shit Scorpion King. First up, let's look at two examples from the same director, Peter Jackson, best known as the director of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Now, the orcs from the Lord of the Rings were actually done with practical effects. This dude right here was put together with prosthetics and makeup, and I think we could all agree he looks pretty damn good. The makeup effects, the armour, the size and build, even the contact lenses on the eyes, they all add up to a pretty convincing character on screen. He's still vaguely humanoid, but monstrous and deformed at the same time. A bit like your average nightclub goer in Aberdeen. Now consider a similar antagonist from the Hobbit trilogy, made more than a decade later and relying more heavily on CGI. You see how boring and lifeless his face looks now? How there's no real detail or expression in his features, his clothes, or his overall appearance? He's just this dull grey blob that does absolutely nothing. He's not intimidating and he's not interesting, and in fact it's very obvious that he doesn't even exist. I know which one I'd rather have in my movie. Damn man, we're even using CGI on actors themselves now, like Natalie Portman, who in reality looks like she's been on hunger strike for 3 weeks straight. But what's a girl to do when she's forced to play a big buff goddess of thunder? Does she go through months of intense physical training and dieting to build herself up, just like her male co-star? Or does she just show up as she is and let the CGI department give her the body she couldn't be bothered building for herself? I think we all know the answer to that one. Now, I could probably prattle on for hours about this shit, giving you example after example of practical effects winning out over CGI, but I think you get the point I'm making here. The more movies rely on CGI, the less engaging the experience becomes for the audience.
And this is where I get the sense of sort of the nuance feathered, that technology, sacrifice, they need to come together.
Because deep down, they know there's really nothing behind it. Yeah, there's a shit ton of work involved to make it look convincing, and I'm not trying to take anything away from the animators here, but it's not the same kind of work that has to go into shooting a continuous 5-minute action sequence where a single mistake can mean having to restart the whole thing from scratch. It's not the same as actors and stunt performers having to risk injury or death to capture some breathtaking stunts. And it's not the same as actors having to lumber around the set wearing heavy prosthetics or spend hours in the makeup chair to achieve the right result on screen. Yeah, computer animation can overcome the physical limitations of practical effects, but what's the point if nobody actually buys into what they're seeing? CGI absolutely...
And it's that buys into. It's... Where's that? Well, it's in there somewhere.
Has its place in modern movie making. In fact, it's a vital weapon in the arsenal of most filmmakers now, allowing them to show things that would be almost impossible to achieve any other way. But it's not a magical solution to every problem. It's not there to turn live action movies into tightly controlled animating features with occasional appearances from real actors. It should be used to enhance practical effects, not to replace them. If you suck all of the risk and challenge and inventiveness out of movie making and try to replace it with sterile animated spectacle, then you take away the most important aspect of movies altogether, the humanity. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a price that I'm not willing to pay. Anyway,
Alright. So, I'm about out of time, and I just wanted to illustrate some of this thinking about technology, how it's tempting when we're looking at the rush of this war against humanity and what progress wants to say, oh, it's never as easy as just, it always has to do with sacrifice, because the relationship between meaning and sacrifice is integral. the Israelite had to bring not a crappy lamb or an almost dead lamb, but a spotless lamb. And, I think one of Peterson's best rules, do what is meaningful, not what's expedient. Technology tends to be about the expedient, but again, we're not going to get rid of technology. And I think, again, Peugeot's, I'll have to figure out what video that was in, but Peugeot's observation that in some ways the kingdom of Cain gets finally employed, conquered, and colonized by the city of man, gets colonized by the city of God, to put it in Augustine's language. So again, these are all just kind of rough thoughts, but I hope that they're helpful in some way.